It's actually the last speaker for today, and it's the conference summary and the comments. And that will be made by Donlyn Lyndon. And, you know, Donlyn, you don't really need an introduction, so I will just say, please get on stage. Donlyn is a legend, and we all love him.
Oh, my. Well, many unexpected things in this day, including that wonderful introduction, which I will enjoy living with for some time. It's been, as I had anticipated, a day of great interest, stimulating for the mind and for the senses. And speaking of performance, what we just went through is pretty astonishing. Yeah. It's especially important, I think, at the start, to note what wasn't expected, at least by me. It was by the organizers. That is the embodiment in the place itself of the fundamental notions of the conference. That performance is always a part of what we are and what we do. And the making of the special environment that we've been in, place we've been in today, has been a wonderful example of that. If we are to be fully aware of ourselves, our companions in this world, and the nature of the environments in which we live, we need to be reminded of that, even surprised by that performance is what we're all about, through reflection and directed attention, as we have been here by the encounters with the white carpet, the lighted surrounds, the transformation of this space into something that will make it much more memorable than it otherwise would have been. The actions that we take within a defined context can be, usually are, reflexive, called forth from the routines of daily existence, programmed in our minds and bodies as a response to certain familiar stimuli, the presence of a path, the beckoning welcoming of a chair, the actions of those around us, the messages embedded throughout our surroundings in the shape of things, and the traces of their making. We're constantly surrounded as well by signs and messages, visually projected images, instructions, appeals and warnings, and the actions that they imply or press upon us. Our environment becomes a part of ourselves. To perform is to carry out an intended set of movements or actions, usually in a prescribed manner, and for the benefit of others, as in a musical performance or medical operation. The term performative seems to emerge from the study of linguistics and refers to words that are themselves some kind of action or instruction, and that it influences the nature of the person using the word, it's not just a description. They're concepts and terms that are not merely descriptive, but that become active in forming the identity of a person or a group. Performative places are, by extension, environments that contribute to the formation of a group or of cultural or social affinities. Decades ago, the philosopher Susanne Langer identified the fundamental importance of architecture as an art that, as she said, created ethnic domain. That is, as an art that brings the elements of building within the grasp of cultural groupings. Character of our times is such that ethnic groupings now seem to be either fiercely confined, sometimes brutally protected, or in full flux of absorption and change, often at both at the same time. So that word does not help us so much. More recent scholars, like Stanislav Rudovsky, have used the term performative places to refer to the wide array of combinations of grouping and identity that now create our social identities, and that are formed around both physical conditions close by and the persistent appeal of remote electronic communication, the fascination that attaches to maintaining contact with others, no matter how far away. We could do a sample. I mean, how many people in this room have been in touch with somebody not in this room during the course of this afternoon or the day? I'm sure most everybody. Our groupings and associations now are widely dispersed and interlocking, and we take part in creating them. The physical places of our world become, therefore, places that are constantly in need of readjustment and change. They are inevitably charged with extraordinary overlays of imagination and association. But the physical is present. It does affect how we perform. It does bring us together with others and with the tangibles of being, with light and its magic flows of radiance, with air and water and their capacity to nourish us, with earth and its transformed surfaces that configure our movements, and with the composite elements and biotics that sustain the vegetation that provides food and shelter for us and for what used to be called, interestingly, the animal kingdom, with which we share our space on this globe. The places in which we live and work and play are decisive in our lives. We need to keep finding new ways of understanding what's around us and what will become of it. We need to learn to make compelling places that bring people back into touch with the immediate, with the physical world at hand, with that which calls the body into performance and the mind into awareness. What might a place become? How can it be sustained? In what ways will we be able to share our common ground for multiple purposes are all questions that require constant attention. Given all that this implies, the conference has been about finding ways to draw in resources with which to see and experience and know in new and productive ways. That takes not only insight and imagination, but the spirit of adventure, of which we've seen a lot, and the will to make things happen, of which we've also seen a lot, but which aren't necessarily common attributes in the world out there. It requires being able to bring others to share in those explorations and to risk the unexpected. In the presentations today, we've seen several ways of bringing new insights to bear. To just briefly refer to them, these include imagining and crafting new forms of building and public space that prompt us to look again, not at them, but at their surroundings, and to see them in a different way. I think the Oslo Opera House is a very interesting example in that case. It's looked at always as a thing, but actually I think its most important contribution is making us look at what's around it and see it in a much larger context. And buildings that can do that, can make us not just say, oh, here's a building and oh, it does or doesn't fit, but here's a building and it tells us something or asks us something about what's around. Those are things which are really important to do. To be successful in this requires engaging with others in a quick and vigorous way, as we've seen Jenny do in her presentation and in her responses as a moderator. The quality of being willing to listen and to engage and act right away is something which you've seen exhibited several times here, and it's fundamentally important to achieving your goals. A second way has been setting out analytical diagrams that restructure the ways in which we think about relationships between buildings and territories. This can open up different patterns of accommodation in space, as Renee Chow has shown us in her examination of the potential of field urbanism. Such diagrams of interweaving of grids and existing patterns and working with, incorporating natural growth within what is envisioned, working with what she called the relational conditions, can bring us to see opportunities for interaction between people, interaction between buildings and environment that are not normally revealed by our study processes. Thinking beyond economic analyses to examine the social consequences has been Peter Elmland's contribution to the day, to the field. Examining the economic patterns of exchange that differing forms of shopping arrangements accommodate that is a very important process, one that actually Peter wrote about a decade or so ago in the journal Places that I used to edit, and which he has now developed into a much more extensive and deep understanding of that question of the size of entrepreneurship, the size of spaces that are made, and what they allow to happen. It's a very stimulating area. From that work, Peter has also come to understand that externalities of investment, as he described it, need to be always things which lead to making good places, and that has been then related to his continuing commitment to working with the UN Habitat to try to get them to see that worldwide development should be thought about in terms of the concept of place and how that can bring multiple benefits to all ranges of the community. His support, obviously, through the Axon Johnson Foundation has been absolutely critical to the existence and continuing life of SUDes. Another is finding many ways to make the public domain more enjoyable for all its inhabitants in their various ways of being. That has been Han-Chi Lee's enduring commitment. She's been constantly calling out the need for sensitive accommodations within and between larger structures primarily developed without attention to human concerns. They've been developed for programmatic needs that are without human consequence. She makes her arguments through research and representation of intimate dimensions within larger structures. We should all join her in this search and build it into our ways of designing, so that becomes a second nature to what we think about when we design. Another great source of reimagining our future is bringing forward fresh intertwining of cities and buildings with nature, and then presenting them boldly, as Ilko Hofmann and his colleagues at Grow Max have done, in ways that gather motivations, invest imaginative energy at every scale of representation. There's astonishing different kinds of viewing what the possible futures might be, involving natural processes as well as more traditional ones, are very important. Finding the fundamental sources of the character of an area and working to make them more effective in planning large-scale changes is an absolutely necessary strategy for giving sense to our future. Matthias Karlholm follows another trail towards understanding, using his scholar's path to look through to study carefully the definitions in sociology. And I've lost them on the back of the piece of paper here. To remind you, he has told us about the way in which people are now thinking about public domains. But there are the complicated, really careful different definitions of how public happens and what it does, and how people, he spoke about the public as actually something which was problem solving, that it was really when people needed to have something together that they became a public. And he looked for different ways that that kind of appropriation could happen, and what the scale of spaces of appearance could be, left us with the charge to think about responsivity, how it is that environments in the public are able to take advantage of initiative and respond to it, of the looking at the importance of interstitial spaces, the places in between that are not yet committed either to being private or to being public, but are the places where people might, like on a porch, or as the example he used, or in a colonnade, gather together in the act of becoming something else. And then he also thought it was important to have what he called crowd space affordance, the opportunity for large groups of people to come together. Now I am lost. So with that set of things, we then came to another set of three that have three presentations that have shown adding specific elements to spaces, to sites, which create performative places with qualities that bring fresh aspects to mind. And so it's been interesting to see these three different ways of people having made things that bring our attention to things differently. The ingenious use of new technologies in lighting, carefully placing light so that it is actually turning out to wash the environment, to make the environment more evident, to make places more evident, to make nature more evident at night, to, as you said, help us to see the investment that's been made in a place, has been very important, very stimulating, beautiful illustrations. I don't think I need to say very much about Katerina Vandrova and Cyril Pavlu's presentation because it has been so present with us. And it is such a marvelous thing to see these people step out of ELOUD and into the world and make things happen. But not just make things happen and be happy about that, but make things happen and be willing to tell other people about it, and to gather that wonderful exhibit and the pillow cloud and all of that together. So there was the using light to show places in a different way, using installations to show things, interventions to show things in a different way, and then Ava's description just now of using her imagination, her incredible persuasive powers, and her insistence that things are not impossible, that they're impossible but not doable. Showing how that kind of continual energy, and several times illustrating it so that people could see a piece and then move on farther, that incremental development with the actual energies of both artists and people willing to think through financial implications and make commitments has been enormously effective and can be inspiring to us all. We might say now that we've seen here 5 modes of reconsideration. One is making forms that reawaken our interest in relationships. 2 is analyzing territories as patterns of potential interaction. 3 is viewing places in ways that engage both fragile human bodies and large economic mechanisms in the society. 4 is returning the focus of attention to the natural world and the landscapes of settlement. And then recoloring, if you might say, the ways we look at what presently exists through making lived suggestions for change. Together these, absorbing the performative aspects of place, offer an array of steps forward that are able to mobilize many aspects of our societies to become involved in positive change. In conclusion, I want to thank SUDes for continuing to what I once described as turn the page. It's always turning the page to look repeatedly for new information, examples, and sources, while keeping its central commitment to understanding the import of place and the abilities that urban designers have to engage new conditions while sustaining a central focus on human consequence. I would also note that Harrison Fraker, whose quote was part of the charge of this conference, has played an important role. He serves as an unrelenting and perceptive scout of ideas and studies that move the field forward. And finally, a great vote of gratitude for Peter Sjostrom and the staff of SUDes, who constantly provide a productive mix of ideas that open paths for generations of students and seekers and constantly bring us back in touch with ourselves, how we are in the world, which is the ultimate source of our engagement. Thank you.